Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very delighted to be hosting Professor Robert Schmuhl, who's here to discuss his new book, Mr. Churchill in the White House, The Untold Story of a Prime Minister and Two Presidents. For nearly 40 years, Bob taught at Notre Dame and is chair emeritus in American Studies and Journalism. He's written previously on the American presidency and on American political culture and contemporary communication, among other subjects. But he's also harbored a lifelong fascination with Winston Churchill. So much so that a special section of his personal library is devoted to volumes and volumes about the great British statesman. Bob's new book represents, in his words, a sort of literary marriage between his longtime interests in the US presidency and Churchill. It's focused on the British leader's visits to the White House under Roosevelt and later under Eisenhower, visits that were not only unusual in some cases for their duration, sometimes lasting several weeks, but they took on diplomatic and military significance as Churchill used them, as Bob writes, to troll Washington with his ideas and views in hopes of luring presidents to initiate joint activities involving Britain and the United States. Churchill, of course, was an enthusiastic proponent of the notion of a special relationship between the two countries. He first used the term in a 1946 speech, and his up-close and personal advocacy for America to align itself with British interests employed both charm and relentlessness. Now, Bob draws on a range of sources, diaries, letters, government documents, and memoirs, to provide quite a detailed and revealing account of the days Churchill, Roosevelt, and Eisenhower spent together, or the days that Churchill spent with Roosevelt and spent with Eisenhower. While stories have proliferated over the years about the Prime Minister's stays at the White House, Bob does his best to separate fact from fiction. But even in Bob's telling, Churchill comes across as at times not the easiest of house guests. Given, among other unconventional habits, his tendency to wander the hallways in the early hours wearing only a dressing gown with a cigar in hand. Other times, he was encountered with nothing on at all. Indeed, Eleanor Roosevelt would have preferred Churchill to occupy Blair House across the street from the White House instead. Anyway, Bob's book offers a fresh and frequently entertaining look at U.S.-British relations at the highest level during an important span of history. And moderating the discussion this evening about these special relations will be one of our country's leading political correspondents, Bob Costa, who's chief election and campaign correspondent for CBS News, so you can imagine he has nothing to do these days. Bob previously served as a national political reporter at the Washington Post and as moderator and managing editor of Washington Week on PBS. He also co-wrote with Bob Woodward the best-selling book Peril, about the tumultuous transition between the Trump and Biden presidencies. Plus, he has his own connection to Churchill, which he will explain in a minute. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bob Schmuhl and Bob Costa.
Thank you so much, Brad. Appreciate it. Good evening to everyone. Thanks so much for coming out here tonight. I'm Bob Costa with CBS, and I'm really honored to be here not only with one of the great authors and professors, but my former professor at the University of Notre Dame, Robert Schmuhl. He is a terrific journalist, professor, academic. Over the years, he has written about everyone from Father Theodore Hesburgh to essay collections about his journalism, to writing about the Easter Uprising and Ireland's exiled children, to one of my most favorite books in recent memory, The Glory and the Burden, about the American presidency. And so when Brad talked about the literary marriage that has led to this project, Mr. Churchill in the White House, I was so intrigued because it also does have a personal element for me as a journalist and just as a person. When I was at the University of Notre Dame, I was thinking about what to do after college, and I decided ultimately to go to the University of Cambridge in England to get a master's degree at the encouragement of Professor Schmuhl, and I studied Winston Churchill. And I spent a year at Queens College and a lot of time at Churchill College, and I studied the Anglo-American relationship. So almost 20 years later, after I first met Professor Schmuhl, now he is writing about Churchill in the White House. And we just spent a lot of time today in Washington, D.C., taping a really special conversation on Churchill that'll air on CBS Saturday morning. The following Saturday, I believe that would be July 13th, if I'm correct. It'll air on CBS Saturday morning. So anyway, welcome, Professor Schmuhl, to Washington, D.C. and to Politics and Prose. Mr. Churchill in the White House has so many fun anecdotes about Sir Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister. It has story after story about what it was like to encounter Churchill in the White House. But what your book also captures is the urgency of the moment in late 1941, when this prime minister decides to come across the treacherous waters of the Atlantic to visit Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, after Pearl Harbor, after the United States has been attacked. Take us into that moment, the seriousness of it, when Churchill decides in 1941 to come to the White House.
Thank you, Bob. Winston Churchill had wanted the United States to get involved. I suspect most of you are aware of the speech that he gave less than a month into his prime ministership when he said, "We shall never surrender. We will fight on the beaches. We will fight in the fields." And you know the statement. That sentence encompasses 141 words. It ends with him saying that he hopes the new world will come to the rescue and liberation of the old. And I say that for this reason. He had gone through the Battle of Britain. He had endured the Blitz, the many days of bombing in London and elsewhere in England, so that when Pearl Harbor was attacked, he immediately made the decision, I will go to Washington and I will create the Grand Alliance. And that meant going to the White House. He does it very secretively. It takes 10 days of fighting gales, storms, the possibility of a U-boat attack. Finally, on December 22nd, he arrives, and they do not announce it until he is in behind the gates of the White House. He has told the president, I will be with you for about a week. He left on January 14th. We can all do the mathematics involved in that. He gave new meaning to the concept of a house guest. And during that time, you have this very interesting sort of interplay of the public and the private. And the public included, on the day after arrival, he and Franklin Roosevelt do a press conference. At that point, Winston Churchill, who I don't think any of us would say would be sort of ready for the Summer Olympics, physically, jumps on a chair and waves to the reporters who were in the back because they wanted to see him, wanted to see what this man looked like. The next day, he and Franklin Roosevelt speak at the dedication of the Christmas tree, the national Christmas tree. It was the first time that he had spoken on American soil. Americans knew of him, but they had never heard him directly, and all the radio stations carried the event. In his remarks, he referred to the White House as the summit of the United States. That's an important word for him. It would later become even more important, but it's an important concept for him. He wanted to be with the Americans, and he wanted to be sure that they were on his side and that they would listen to his advice and his strategy about the war. The next day is Christmas. He and Franklin Roosevelt go to church. Winston Churchill was not a great attendee at religious services of any kind. Later said to Dwight Eisenhower, when Dwight Eisenhower asked him to go to church, he said, "I will meet my maker soon enough." But they go to church, come home. Winston Churchill sits through a portion of a movie that is being shown at the White House that night, Oliver Twist, and gets up during it and says, "I need to do my homework." His homework was to finish writing a speech to a joint session of Congress, which he delivered on December the 26th. I say that for this reason. He wanted to become well known to Americans during that first trip. How well known? I discovered that there were two sets of twins that were named Winston and Franklin. There were little boys who were named Winston as a result of the attention he received during that period. And no fewer than 5,000 cigars arrived at the White House. Now, for the sake of security, because they didn't know what might be in them, poison or, whatever, all of them were just thrown in the incinerator, and, that killed him, but that was the fact of life. He received mail at the White House. One of the letters arrived. It's still in the Churchill Archives holdings, and it was just addressed this way: Churchill the Magnificent, the White House, Washington, D.C. We should all get mail of that kind. And what I'm suggesting is he was becoming someone, and he was using the new popularity to advance his cause. And his cause was the cause of democracy, the cause of freedom. And for this particular visit, he wanted to make sure that even though the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, that the alliance would focus on Germany first. Very important to get Germany out of the way and then deal with Japan. And as history unfolded, that's exactly what transpired. After that, things settle down and they get to work and they put together the opening of the war strategy linking the U.S. and the British troops. But it's a fascinating opening to the series of visits that he made to the U.S., and 7 different times he is staying at the White House.
In our business, Professor, at CBS, we often use the phrase fact check. Fact check this. Was Churchill often in pajamas or naked while he was at the White House?
You're very impertinent. The answer is yes to both. In fact, Secretary of War Stimson comes to the White House on December the 24th of 1941. And with him, can't make this up, talk about fact checking, you nosy reporters. He brought with him a general by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. And what is in the Stimson diary, which is fascinating in itself, is Stimson reacting somewhat disapprovingly to what Churchill was wearing. He was un déshabillé, or the French phrase, and some of you would know it. He just thought, my goodness, he's in the White House. Why is he wearing an outfit as he was, which is, he ran around in what he referred to as his siren suit. His siren suit was the equivalent of onesies for a baby, okay? And he called it his siren suit because he could jump into this outfit so quickly during bombings and then stroll around wherever he was. Now, that is when he is dressed. When he's not dressed, and one critic said I dwelled too long on this, so I'll speak quickly, maybe. But they lived in what he said was familial intimacy at the White House. And Churchill and Roosevelt often worked in bed, okay? Churchill would dictate and read and work with various staff members while he was in bed in the Rose bedroom at the White House. And Franklin Roosevelt, because of his inability to walk, would often be in bed and would be working there. So they would go back and forth from room to room. And one time, Churchill, here's a trivial fact that you should all know, he took 2 baths a day, regardless of where he was. 2 baths. He was coming out of the bath on January the 1st of 1942, and Franklin Roosevelt had been thinking all night about a new name for the alliance against Nazi Germany, Italy, and the Japanese. And he came up with the phrase United Nations, the United Nations. Pretty important phrase, I think all of us would agree. And he's very enthusiastic about sharing that with Churchill. So he goes to his room at the White House and opens the door, and there is the Prime Minister, having just arisen from his bath, and he apologizes a little, and Churchill is alleged to have said, "I have nothing to conceal from the President of the United States." But what is, to me, humorous in a historical way, and this is all very serious in its import, is that Franklin Roosevelt loved to tell the story and said to his Irish Catholic secretary, "You know, Grace, he's pink and white all over." And that's the Roosevelt rendition. As I say, he told it to many people, and that's all in the book. But I think the other one, and I will stop here on this particular point, by saying that in January, just before Churchill returned to the United Kingdom, Wendell Willkie, who had run against Roosevelt in 1940, okay, Wendell Willkie from my home state of Indiana was the Republican candidate, and they had been friends to a certain degree, Roosevelt and Willkie stops by the White House. And the president says, "Do you want to see Winston while you're here?" And they too had known each other. "Oh, sure, let's go." So they go to his room, and the president says to the person outside, "Is your man up yet?" And Churchill was, in the lovely phrase that he used about himself, a tardy riser. He stayed up till 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, working and doing other things, drinking maybe. And the person at the door said, I don't think so. He said, "Well, let's just see." Door opened, and there, again, in his pink and white all over situation, is the prime minister, who says, and I am quoting again for the historical record, "Pray excuse my state of nature, and please come in." So that I think the long-winded answer to your question is yes and yes.
It's no surprise hearing all of this that the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, did not seem to love the idea of Churchill staying so long. What did you learn throughout the course of your reporting and research about her response and her interactions with Churchill?
Eleanor Roosevelt, first of all, was not informed by her husband.
That's a bad start.
That's a bad start, but a true start, actually. Not informed that they would have visitors that Christmas. And as she, in her column, are you aware that Eleanor Roosevelt had a very popular newspaper column, My Day? It's in over 100 newspapers, I'm pretty sure. And she says this right after it's announced that Churchill has arrived, that she knew nothing about it, and to take care of that group of people coming might involve the moving of furniture and things like that she should have known about. Well, to get to your point, she was someone who did not look favorably upon his habits. He did smoke. I think we acknowledge that. He was known to drink somewhat. He was also known to roam the halls of the White House. And one morning at 3 a.m., he is walking around in his rompers, and she sees him. and says, where are you going? And he says, well, there was one other point I wanted to make to the president. And she says, I think that can wait till breakfast. And she later went to the president and said, I think the government should have a president's guest house. And I think maybe Blair House should be the president's guest house. And in 1942, the government bought Blair House as the president's guest house. But Winston Spencer Churchill never stayed in Blair House, much to the chagrin of Eleanor Roosevelt. In terms of sort of an equal time, what I discovered, and I think it's interesting, Clementine Churchill didn't much care for Franklin Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt did not much care for Winston Churchill. And that dynamic plays out in the course of the visits and in the book.
The White House, such a stage for Winston Churchill, but as your book so carefully documents and illuminates, Churchill struggled at times to get back to the White House by 1943, especially 1944. Roosevelt, running for re-election, has a lot on his mind. Talk about the evolution of Churchill's relationship with Roosevelt and how that affected whether or not he came to the White House.
Great question. And my reading of it is that early on, this visit of 1941 into 1942, then there was a very important visit in June of 1942. We can get into that if you'd like. And then there were two visits that went beyond a couple of weeks in 1943. In May of 1943, and that included his second address to a joint session of Congress, big deal. And then in August, September of 43, it was a matter of, this is kind of interesting. I'm gonna play this one out for a little bit. I argue in the book that among Winston Churchill's traits, I mean, we know him as a politician, statesman, writer, orator, go down the list. He was also a daredevil. He wanted to be in the action. He wanted to be at the action. And in the summer into the fall of 43, I document that he arrives in Canada and goes all the way across Canada to Quebec, and then makes a long journey down to Hyde Park to visit Roosevelt, and then heads back to Canada for the first Quebec conference, and Roosevelt follows suit, goes up there for that big meeting. Then he comes back to the U.S. and spends a couple of weeks at the White House, during which he goes to Harvard and gives an incredibly important speech where he proposes that the residents of the United Kingdom and the people of the United States have joint common citizenship. Yeah, your jaws, I see jaws dropping. You can resume your natural expressions. And it's fascinating. And it's also the time when Franklin Roosevelt says to Winston Churchill, Winston, I'm going to Hyde Park. If you want to stay in the White House and work, you can, but I'm leaving. And sure enough, Winston Churchill stays in the White House, conducts meetings, has appointments, and then finally leaves and goes to Hyde Park to say goodbye to the president. That is all prelude to this. And that is that once Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill sat down with Joseph Stalin, first time was at the Tehran Conference in late November of 1943. What I see happening is that as Winston Churchill tried to woo Roosevelt, Roosevelt is now wooing Stalin. And at one point during that conference, Roosevelt thinks that he's not cutting through, getting through to Stalin. And Churchill walks into the room, and Roosevelt says, you might get a little disturbed about what I'm going to say. Churchill, what's he going to say? What's he going to say? And Roosevelt, deliberately, to try to curry favor with Stalin, begins to make fun of Churchill. Yeah. He got up on the wrong side of the bed today. You can tell, ha-ha, he's not himself, ha-ha. Making jokes about Churchill. And at that point, I would argue that Churchill himself begins to wonder, what is the relationship that I have with the President of the United States? And that's at the very end, as I say, of 43. Going into 1944, Churchill wants a meeting with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt keeps him at a distance, won't make a decision, won't give a date. Finally, you get into the summer, and they have the second Quebec conference up in Canada, and Churchill does come to the United States, but it's a secret visit. It is not released to the world until he is back in London. And at that time, Roosevelt was so fixated on running for his fourth term that he did not want any of the editorialists, commentators in the media, in journalism, to say that he was running on the coattails of the popular Winston Churchill. No, he wanted to run on his own and alone. And I will end on this note. When Franklin Roosevelt did die in April of 1945, Winston Churchill did not come to the funeral. A plane to carry him across the Atlantic was waiting at an airport. And at the last minute, he made the decision that he would not come. It's interpreted a number of different ways. One would be that for security, safety reasons, it was too hazardous. I think you could look at it in a number of different lights. But I am sure, and I hope the book makes this clear, that over time, the relationship did change. And I think all of us almost need to be aware of that.
I found the parts about FDR and Stalin in the book very revealing about, we always hear about 41, 42, FDR and Churchill, the chummy, and the stories are great stories for history, but the relationship was complicated. But what your book also captures is that while Churchill had a frayed relationship toward the end with Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill, after he leaves power, comes back to power years later, and he re-encounters that person he met years before, Dwight Eisenhower, and once again visits the White House, stays in the same room he stayed in when he was with FDR. Help us understand Churchill's relationship with Eisenhower, why it's important, and how it shaped the Cold War.
It's important for a number of reasons. One is that, of course, Eisenhower had been based primarily in London during the Second World War. Of course, he moved around a good deal, but he got to know Churchill very, very well. But it's a different relationship when you have a prime minister and a military leader versus a prime minister and the president of the United States. And Eisenhower, right from the very beginning, and Churchill went out of his way to come to America right after the election. And Eisenhower had not even been inaugurated, and he's having meetings with him. And what Churchill is trying to do at that time is work out a possible, what would you say, less intense Cold War. So you've gone, during the 40s, he's the warrior and the warlord, and into the 50s, he's trying to become the peacemaker. And the word that I used early on, the summit of the United States, he begins to use that word summit for a meeting among the three leading powers, the US, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. And he thinks, possibly in a misguided way, but I'm just reporting and not trying to editorialize at all. He thinks that he can sit down with the two leaders and hammer out some agreement that would reduce the tensions of the Cold War. And he keeps pushing Eisenhower to have this summit of the big three. And Eisenhower never relents while Churchill is the prime minister. But what to me became fascinating in going through all the records of their relationship was how Churchill rose in Eisenhower's admiration. Not only when he was the prime minister the second time, and remember, this is important, he's the prime minister twice and longer than a two-term president, okay? But when Churchill ultimately resigns the prime ministership, Eisenhower goes out into the Rose Garden, into the just outside the White House, and gives a very moving, very personal statement, congratulating him, saying history will be kind to him, and things of that nature. And even the newspaper said how rare it was for a president to come out and to speak so movingly about another figure. And Churchill returns in 1959. So he is no longer prime minister. He's still in the House of Commons. And Eisenhower decides he's going to clear his schedule for several days and take Winston Churchill around, talk to him, visit with him, have events with him. And Eisenhower takes him to his farm in Gettysburg, and they go around in a golf cart. You'd expect that from Eisenhower. A golf cart, and they visit all the sites. And Churchill, in the helicopter, points out to Eisenhower. Now, this is where Pickett's charge was during the Civil War, and this is where such and such happened. He was a great student. Churchill was a great student of the U.S. Civil War. And what I found, which I thought was interesting and also in its way significant, at the Eisenhower Library out in Abilene, Kansas, was a file, very thin file, but it said, "Tuck this away in Sir Winston's spot." And it was the President of the United States statement had Winston Churchill passed away while Eisenhower was still president. He wanted to be on the record. He wanted a very strong statement to be made of his feelings and regard for Churchill, so that it becomes a very human story of two war leaders, and they did not agree on some fundamental aspects of the war. In fact, in the book, I show that Churchill deleted some sections of the final volume that were critical of Eisenhower. So when you talk about history, is it political? It certainly was political, because the prime minister did not want to have in his memoir of the war any statements that were critical of the new president of the United States.
That's a great part of the book. Churchill, of course, wins the Nobel Prize for Literature and is a world-class writer, but he deletes all these parts of the book that are dismissive of Eisenhower because he wants to have that relationship. If you ever get a chance to go to Gettysburg to see Eisenhower's farm, they still have the golf cart that Churchill went around with Churchill. What's interesting is that Churchill comes in '59 to see Eisenhower, but this book, Mr. Churchill in the White House, is also about the lingering influence Churchill had over the White House and the American presidency. If you could just reflect for a moment about how President John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, admired Churchill, perhaps unlike his father, and so did Lyndon Baines Johnson after JFK.
It's very interesting. Certainly, John Kennedy's father was not known as a great admirer of Winston Churchill. He was the ambassador to the court of St. James. The somewhat catty remark attributed to Randolph Churchill, never verified, was that he thought daffodils were yellow until he saw the back of Joe Kennedy. I'll let you all absorb that. But John F. Kennedy, saw Churchill as someone that he admired for a number of reasons. Political, yes. Writer, yes. Orator, yes. And shortly after John Kennedy was inaugurated, he learned that Winston Churchill was cruising in the Caribbean on, I can't make this up, Aristotle Onassis's yacht. Fill in the rest of that sentence. And he learns that the ship has docked in New York and gets on the phone and says, I will send my plane. And I would love to have Mr. Churchill come to the White House for a few days, and we will just talk. And Churchill's assistant made the decision that that would not happen. And the reason was that he was frail, and he did not want all of the attention that would be focused on the visit to show him in that condition. And I think it was probably a smart decision on his part. So they don't meet, but about 5 or 6 months before John Kennedy is assassinated, he confers honorary citizenship on Winston Churchill. First time in American history that honorary citizenship has been granted to someone from another country. And he gives this tremendous speech. And it's all glowing and all that. And in the book, it struck me. He says, Kennedy, that Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. Oh, isn't that that's a great phrase. Well, the person who wrote that phrase was the CBS journalist and broadcaster, Edward R. Murrow. For the 80th anniversary of his birthday, Murrow said, probably the most important figure on the world stage is Winston Churchill. He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. And here's the irony. Edward R. Murrow had left CBS. John Kennedy had hired him to be the head of the U.S. Information Agency. Edward R. Murrow was sitting in the audience when Kennedy read the speech granting Churchill honorary citizenship.
That's a wonderful story. It's funny, I don't think I've ever told you this. Sitting on my desk at CBS is an old record of Edward R. Murrow narrating Winston Churchill's speeches. That was a big seller decades ago. Should be still. Well, if you want to ask a question of Professor Schmuhl, we'll begin the Q&A in just a second here. Professor Schmuhl, before we get to the questions from the audience, any reflections about the White House and the presidency and what Churchill saw in it? Churchill, of course, had an American mother. He had an affection for the United States. But in particular, your book shows he had an appreciation for the power of the presidency.
He did, and one of the one of the points I try to make is that Winston Churchill in the 1930s was this almost singular figure about the dangers from Nazi Germany. A lot of people made fun of him, said he was going too far. He warned the world about the threat from totalitarianism. At the same time that he recognized the importance and the power of the United States. He knew that the British Empire was in decline, that its best days were probably over. And he wanted to make sure that the United Kingdom and the United States remain closely tied because of this positive. The warning about Nazi Germany, and later, of course, the Fulton, Missouri speech of 1946 about the threat of the Soviet Union, the descent of the Iron Curtain. You all know that. But positively, he saw America as this new colossus on the world stage. And he saw the presidency itself as so important and significant in shaping the forces of democracy, of freedom, of Western civilization. And so the presidency and the people in the presidency were important to him, and his trips to the White House allowed him to emphasize the relationship, the special relationship, to the point of common citizenship, as I mentioned, and it's an interesting dynamic. The United Kingdom is going down, and the U.S. is going up. He is going up as a world statesman at the same time that Franklin Roosevelt is declining. Isn't that interesting? So on a human level, things are happening. On a international level, things are happening, and I think it's a tribute to him that someone who was so steeped in history, and he was. The point I make is that he was steeped in history and thought about it, while Franklin Roosevelt largely thought about the future. He was looking ahead. The United Nations, this was really important to him. But Churchill is steeped in history, wants history to be a positive force, sees America as this positive force, and wants to come to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to be sure that his viewpoint is heard and heeded.
Powerful. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Oh, do we ever need Churchill now? One thing you said perplexed me. I was born in the 1940s. Churchill and FDR were great heroes that I grew up with. This business about the Soviets, Churchill was a conservative.
Yep.
And communism, they were allergic to it. Whereas fascism, the conservatives in Britain, not so much. So where did this, and of course, Churchill knew Stalin and knew all of the things that he had done. Why did he think that, why was there an effort at rapprochement?
You're saying after the war?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, he knew. And actually, both Roosevelt and Churchill realized that the promises that Stalin had made at Yalta in February of 1945,
Right.
they were hollow promises. And they realized that in March. And then, of course, Roosevelt is dead in April. But Churchill, and again, possibly in not his greatest moment, thought that he could influence what Stalin was doing, what he might do, what would happen. He was frightened by the hydrogen bomb. Churchill was.
Okay.
And of course, you had the atomic bomb, and then the hydrogen was much more powerful.
Right.
And Churchill was very aware of that. So that his second term as prime minister in the international realm, he is trying as hard as he can to reduce those tensions. And quite frankly, I said the other day that if you had a way of measuring self-confidence, Winston Churchill would have been off the charts. He thought that he could pull rabbits out of non-existent hats. And I think it could have been a delusion on his part, but he thought that maybe there was a way of doing it. And of course, Stalin dies.
Thank God.
Well, we won't bring God into that equation, but it's a situation where he's trying to do something, it didn't work out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk and your book. It sounds really, really interesting.
Thank you.
So my question is, all of these sort of unusual actions that Churchill took at the White House, you know, going about naked, walking in this dressing gown, wandering the halls, overstaying his visit. Is this unique to the White House, or did he do these things any other official visit that he made to other countries, or, you know, possibly also in his own house? But are we aware of anything official where he kind of acted this way elsewhere, or is it just with us?
Well, that's maybe that's a second book. How did he comport himself when he went to Moscow to visit Stalin, which he did? From everything that I know, he was indeed the character that we think he was. I read somewhere not terribly long ago that he loved to listen to marching music and would march around checkers, you know, flamboyantly. I think that's who he was. I mean, this is not revealing anything. It's in the book. There's, I think, a picture in the book. I mean, he modeled his siren suit outside the White House, okay, to show off his stylish, you know, haberdashery or whatever word we'd use. He was who he was. And a creature of so many different facets. I haven't mentioned his painting. If you ever see a painting of his, he was a remarkable painter. And someone came up behind him once and said, that's a beautiful painting. And he turns and says, genius has many outlets. Thank you.
Thank you.
The British ambassador here in Washington, Karen Pierce, has an original Churchill painting in her residence.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very special.
Yeah, thank you.
The future of India must have been a point of tension between Britain and America at this point. Did that figure in the relationship of Churchill and Roosevelt?
It did. It did. And Roosevelt was very strongly anti-imperialist and would make fun of Churchill's enduring embrace of the British Empire. And at one of his visits, someone brought up the Indian question. And it's in the book, the back and forth. And he threw it back on the person and said, now, are you talking about the Indians far away, or are you talking about the Indians who are here in America and their contemporary condition? So he was well aware of the criticism that he was getting from all sides in this country vis-a-vis India. And the only way, really, that you can explain it, and I'm certainly knowledgeable about all the criticism of Churchill today, is that he was so much a creature of the Victorian era. And you know, he was in the military in India, in a number of different places. So he saw the empire in action, and in later life, just wouldn't let go. You know, the sun never set on the British Empire. He did not want that sun to set either. So that you have this situation where he sees the rise of the U.S. at the same time that he's trying desperately to hold on to the sunshine of the empire.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, according to Brad, and then you can come up and ask the professor when he's signing books. The professor will be, Professor Schmuhl will be signing books after, but we'll have one more question here. Then we'll have some time for you to get your book signed.
There's an undercurrent of curiosity, anger, that maybe Winston Churchill set the Dieppe up to head off a cross-channel invasion. Any good book you could recommend that would deal with that?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
The Dieppe raid, which was August of 43, am I right?
42.
Or is it 42? Which was in northern France, and it was disastrous. Mostly on Canadians were involved in it, and many were killed, many were captured, injured. Boy, this is going to be a hard one to do in 30 seconds, but what I'm going to say is Winston Churchill was someone who was slow to embrace the cross-channel operation, meaning D-Day, 80 years ago. And he would say he was for it, and then things would happen and nothing would happen. Okay. In fact, in the book, there are a number of different places where Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, says, the man from London is coming and he's going to knife us in the back again on D-Day. Yeah. I mean, it's very strong, very strong. So that what he was afraid of was that there would be massive casualties and that it would be, in a way, what he had faced and endured in the First World War, which was the Gallipoli situation. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, took a tremendous hit over Gallipoli because it was a failure. It was a failure. And he leaves the Admiralty and, in fact, goes to the Western Front as a military officer, and then has to climb back into the high offices of the British government. But he is reluctant to sign off on the cross-channel because out of fear. But he finally says, I will do it. I will harden, I will approve, I will go. And what does Winston Churchill do? He says to Dwight D. Eisenhower, I want to be on a ship in the Channel on D-Day. And Dwight Eisenhower goes, you what? You want to be on a ship? And finally, the king, George VI, intervenes and says, if he's going to be on a ship, I want to be on a ship too. And so they decide that Winston Churchill, who finally had agreed, will not be there on D-Day.
And we thank you for being here tonight, and a round of applause for Professor Robert Schmuhl. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Politics and Prose.
So copies of Mr.